just listened to a podcast about companies doing stupid things. And remind me of a story. I don't know if I told this story before or not, but I used to work for a major corporation. They were the overarching, the parent corporation was like the third biggest company in the world. And I worked for a little teeny tiny division. And I was a repair engineer. But the problem was I inherited the department, and I did a decent job for being a relatively new engineer per se. I mean, I was a mechanic for 8 years, and I got a degree in engineering, but I'd only worked at this job for like 2 years, and still learning the ropes and understanding things, and I was proficient. I was good enough. I wasn't a star engineer, but I was good enough. And one time I was talking to a fellow engineer. He wasn't really an engineer. He's more like a supervisor, managing supervisor. And I said, it's it's frustrating that the company, at the time, the company subcontracted the work that my department did to another company. And I was in charge of putting together repair bids. And so I would, the equipment would come in. I would have my my department workers look them over, calculate how much repair needs to be done, and then I would work up a quote on how much it would cost to repair each component. They called it a cost model, quote cost model. And so I did that, for 2 years. And the upper sales division would complain that we were charging too much for these repairs. I was like, I don't control what the employees get paid, and I don't control consumable hardware that goes on these components. So these are the prices I'm given. These are the hours that were estimated to repair these parts, and that's what the repair costs on each component is. And it was a whole set of parts. But they're like, well, you need to reduce costs, and they implemented like lean manufacturing training and all that to try to reduce costs, which is cool. I like the lean manufacturing training. I'll have to talk about that later. But so one of the things was going to the subcontract company to learn how they do things, to see if there were cost saving items, and it was a little bit of conflict because they were technically our competitor, but there was so much work, there was enough work that it didn't, we weren't competing for work. They were just another service provider. They could only handle so much, we could only handle so much. So it wasn't like, hey, we're stealing work from them or they were stealing work from us. So I would go to their facility to learn how they do things. And there were a couple things I picked up, and but some of them we just couldn't do because we didn't have the equipment to do what they did. But the kicker is, I found out that our company provided them the consumable hardware. They did not have to pay for the consumable hardware. So when they quoted a job, it was purely labor. And so I brought that to the attention of the upper sales management and said, hey, the reason why my cost quote cost models were more than that other facility is they don't pay for for the hardware. You know, we provide them the hardware. So internally, if you look at the labor costs, they're pretty much equal. And so they didn't like that. So anyway, I was complaining about that to my coworker, the supervising manager, and you know, he was like, "Yeah, okay." And when I left, my other coworker, who was in the department I used to work in, he overheard the conversation. He goes, "You know, he's right, right?" And the other coworker, the supervising manager, he and I were somewhat friends, and I don't know what he really meant, but my other coworker said, "Yeah," I'll call him Joe. Joe said, "Well, he can leave." So at first, you know, it seemed like, well, if you don't like it here, you can leave. But in my opinion, I think he might have meant, well, you know, there are other jobs that he can find that don't have those same problems, you know, or he's competent enough to where he doesn't have to stay here and take the abuse. In my opinion, knowing my relationship with that other supervisor, that's what he meant. But basically at the time, you know, I was like, I kind of caught off guard, like, well, okay. So I started looking for another job. And so I think like a month later, I was just looking through Monster and found a position that was in my job specialty, and sent my resume in, applied, got interviews. I think I got 2 interviews, and I was not offered the job right away, but then I got a call about a week after that, and they offered me a different position in the same company for, I think, like 10% more than what I was getting paid. So then after I got the offer letter, I went to see my manager, and what was happening was, when I first hired on, I was only responsible for the department that I worked in. And so I, you know, and so I was still learning. I was still picking up the duties and requirements. And man, I was working 12, 14-hour days, you know, doing the best I could to learn to pick up the knowledge. And we moved offices, so I moved into the office with another department engineer, and I was asked to help him do some things. And there were some measurements that other department did, that they took manual readings, right, on a piece of graph paper, and they would hand calculate all the dimensions. And I was like, why don't you do that in Excel spreadsheet? So I wrote an Excel spreadsheet for them, to where, yeah, they key in the data, but then the calculations were automatic. So then they liked me doing that, so then they had me help another department. So now I was the primary repair engineer for my department, and like a helper engineer for 2 other departments. And they had me like do, it's called a CMM, coordinate measuring machine. So they had me learn how to use this CMM, and I had no clue, so I had to read the instruction manuals, figure it out, and it was a little bit off. I got it right, but I was just a little bit off, but the precision needed to be, I think the way the machine measured things, it was a little bit backwards. But anyway, but yeah, I was basically working in 3 different departments, wearing, you know, 3 different hats, multiple hats. And then the engineer for another department, he got let go because of substance issues. So they had me temporarily take over his department, but their supervisor, he was technically minded, so he was able to do the bulk of it, and I just kind of helped with the, you know, spreadsheets and stuff like that, calculations and stuff. But anyway, so I go to my before I thought about leaving, I went to my manager. It's like, hey, you know, when I first signed on, I was only in charge of one department, but you know, as time went on, now I'm charged. I'm helping like three other departments on top of working on my own department. Oh, and they were also limiting overtime. If you worked overtime, you had to submit for approval. And there were like 3 or 4 reasons only that you could that you would get approved for working overtime. And my department was always in one of those reasons. It was either because of waiting to make a shipment, and some other things. But the majority of the reasons why we had to work overtime was we had to you know, we were always late making shipments because delays on hardware, consumable hardware coming in. So we would get so far, and then we'd have to wait for the consumable hardware to come in, and then we'd have to, you know, expedite working on things, and then work weekends to get stuff done. So anyway, I went to him. It's like, you know, would it be okay to, you know, consider maybe a little bit of a raise? And he said, well, you know, we do other things besides pay. You know, I prove overtime and then blah blah blah. And, you know, he gave some kind of excuse. I get it. You know, he's got constraints too. But anyway, so I was like, okay. So when I gave him my 2 weeks notice because I got a different job, they're like, okay, let me go talk to the plant manager. And so he came back and was like, okay, well, you know, we'll pay you for your 2 weeks, but you can leave today. I'm like, okay, you sure you don't want me to stick around and train somebody else as much as I can? It's like, no. So they got me with another engineer that I was friendly with, and I just gave them the Reader's Digest version of what I was doing, left my laptop, you know, everything, and of course my work laptop was purely work, so I gave him my password, all that stuff. It's like, here you go, and I left. It turns out, after I left, I talked to a former coworker of mine who was still there, and he goes, yeah, when you left, it took 3 other engineers to replace you. Versus, yeah, they could have just given me, like, you know, maybe a 5% raise, but nope, it cost them, well, the one, yeah, it cost them a new engineer, plus they had to hire like 2 other engineers to help the other things, but yeah, it cost them way more to replace me than it was if they would have just given me pittance. But it worked out for me, you know. There's that saying, things happen for a reason. Well, it's not that's not the full phrase that I'm aware of. You know, things happen for a good reason. It may not seem like a positive thing when you lose your job, or when you lose a thing, or a relationship, but depending on what your attitude is, or your mentality, it might be the best thing that happened to you. And I'll talk about other things later, but that's that story. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you later. Bye.